For our first introductory presentation, I'm very pleased and, as always, extremely honored to welcome Professor Frank Sysyn back to Cambridge. Professor Sysyn is professor in the Department of History and Classics at the University of Alberta. He's director of the Petro Yatsik Center for Ukrainian Historical Research at Alberta and the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. He's also editor-in-chief of the hugely ambitious Hrushevsky Translation Project. I'd also like to say, I promised Frank I wouldn't effusively, enthusiastically introduce him, but I do want to say he's a long-time moving force in international Ukrainian studies. His fingerprints are on the programs at Harvard, Columbia, Toronto, Alberta, and indeed here at Cambridge as well, and it's many other places beyond it. As a scholar, he's particularly well placed to help contextualize for us the issues and questions revolving around Polish-Ukrainian relations. His first book, Between Poland and Ukraine, The Dilemma of Adam Kissel, 1600 to 1653, is a very rich and intricate work about a man, among other things, who made a career, in fact, attempting to mediate and resolve difficulties and complexities between Ukrainian and Polish communities. So it is a great pleasure for me to introduce Professor Sysyn. Please join me in welcoming him to Cambridge.
Now, I was initially asked to speak about agendas for the 21st century. Fortunately, I was able to convince our speakers that I was our organizers that I was eminently unprepared to speak about that, although I hope to see some of it unfold. And instead, I would take us back to territories and times which I know better, and do so with the assumption that many of the people assembled here are rather conversant with the 20th century but will like to go on with me on a journey to earlier periods. The talk is called Cain and Abel No Longer, Turning the Corner on 350 Years of Polish-Ukrainian Relations. So Cain and Abel No Longer. Sometime between the 1648 uprising, led by Hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and the penning of Samuel Velichko's Kazania in the Cossack Hetmanate in the 1720s, the Biela Tserkva Manifesto took shape. Framed as Hetman Khmelnytsky's call to arms, the language and political thought of the document clearly did not fit Ukraine of 1648. With its call to defend the Otchizna, or fatherland, that it designated as Little Rus Ukraine on both banks of the Dnieper. We don't have our map here, but I think the map is imprinted on all of you. In the 1720s, Mr. Velichko is writing about a Ukraine on both banks of the Dnieper. Those of you who know the fates of the 17th century know that at that point, the Dnieper was the borderline between two states. Ukraine was divided between them. But the theoretical Ukraine for Velichko composed both right and left banks. That text contained the thought and vocabulary of the polity and political culture that emerged after the uprising. Above all, it reflected the need of the elite of the Cossack Hetmanate to justify the Great Revolt and depict their society and polity as legitimate. While the text may have been a collective effort, written and rewritten over decades, its earliest documentation is in this large history of Cossack Ukraine by Velichko, which used Samuel Twardowski's Wojna Domova, Civil War, first published in 1681 as a major source. Twardowski's epic began with the phrase, "Whence came that peasant arrogance? Skąd wzięła się ta hardość chłopska?" And it argued against the rancor of those peasants against their lords that had led the Ukrainian population to fight against the Polish regime rather than join them in a war against the Ottomans and the Muslims. In so doing, it set a vision of in the 17th century and of the 17th century that endured among Poles through Sienkiewicz's works well into the 20th century. Velichko took much of the factual material from Twardowski, but otherwise transformed the historical setting and the motivations of the participants entirely. The Ukrainian reader would receive a vision of the past in which there was no doubt of who was in the right and who was in the wrong. So therefore, early in this text, one finds the Zaporozhian Cossacks writing of the Poles, that their relation with the Poles was like that with a serpent whose tail had been cut off. The earlier friendship can never be restored. But it clearly declared it was the Poles who were the wrong. By the way, that's Aesop that he had taken this account of the serpent from. And in the text, Khmelnytsky is reported to say to the Polish prisoners after the Battle of Batyu in 1652, "Gentlemen Poles, it seems to me that from now on we part from you forever. We will not be yours, and you will not be ours. The woe began not from us, but in fact from you." Now, by the way, Khmelnytsky, to our knowledge, never said these words. These are just what a 17th century, early 18th century text attributes to him. But in Velichko's work, the major purpose and constant refrain is to show that Poland, usually called Korona Polska, and Ukraine are two separate entities, as he conceives them in the early 18th century. But despite Khmelnytsky's purported words, it seems to me from now on we part from you forever. We will not be yours and you will not be ours. The parting, as we know, was not to be so simple. Indeed, the Biela Cerkva Universal, that may have been written by Velichko, illustrated how difficult the break would be. Amidst its patriotic clarion call to the Little Rus to rise up in defense of their rights and fatherland, Khmelnytsky recounts a history of two Sarmatian peoples, with the Ruthenians as the elder. They were two brothers, of whom the younger, later called Lachie and Polakie, rose up and conquered the ancient Kozako-Ruthenian lands. So the purported universal maintained that as Cain had attacked Abel, the Polish brother had raised his hands against the Ruthenian. Now, they were switching younger and elder with Cain and Abel, right? We assume someone else caught that. But clearly, clearly when we have this, we have a common theme in Ukrainian and Polish writing of the 17th and early 18th century. Indeed, another text in Velichko's massive work is the funereal speech to Khmelnytsky by Samuel Zorka, in which Zorka is purported to have said that Khmelnytsky's bravery was shown against your Sarmatian Polish enemies and brothers. Enemies and brothers, as they are called. Now, all of this may remind some of you of these discussions of affinity and older and younger brothers that have so muddied all discussions of Russian and Ukrainian relations lately. But let us return instead to our 17th and 18th century Polish-Ukrainian models. And what I am going to argue today, and I assume that many of the talks we hear will present very good evidence against, is that in fact what we have seen over these 350 years is first the distangling of Poles and Ukrainians, and later of Poland and Ukraine, and ultimately of Polish-Ukrainian states, and that this process has gone on for a 350-year period. Now, one need not argue that the early modern narratives of Twardowski and Velichko were always living in dominant traditions among the various peoples and elites on the Polish and Ukrainian territories. Other narratives emerged and at times played more important roles. Historians and political thinkers could debunk and challenge the authenticity of earlier texts, just as those who challenged the authenticity of the Biela Cerkva Universal did, quite correctly, from the mid-19th century down to the 1920s. National myths could be challenged and tested, just as Olga Gurka did in the 1930s to the holies of Sienkiewicz, and Natalia Yakovenko does today in her writing on the mid-17th century confrontation. Social groups far distant from the early modern combatants could selectively choose from the past and apply, however fallaciously, modern concepts of nation, thereby making the descendants of Podhalia serfs staunch proponents of the noble commonwealth, and scions of Greek Catholic Uniate clergymen ardent supporters of the Haidamaka organizations. Despite the complexity of narratives and the clear differences in meaning of ethnonyms and political concepts over the last 350 years, there are some continuities that have weighed on Polish Ukrainian traditions right down to our age. Timothy Snyder has pointed out the need for attention to the early modern in his Reconstructing Nations, and Zenon Kohut has recently advocated forthrightly on the need to examine the early modern in his Making Ukraine. I would like to beg your indulgence to be disproportionate in my treatment, concentrating on the Ukrainian side of the story, assuming that the countervailing Polish narratives in myths are likely to be better known, and I hope correctly assuming. The first is to argue that early modern Ukraine arose on the map because of war and through the Cossack breakthrough of the late 16th and early 17th centuries. All those modern Ukrainian collectors of cartography avidly look for the headings of Ukraine, land of the Cossacks on Beauplans and Homans and other maps as a way of demonstrating that Ukraine has a considerable lineage. It was the rising of 1648 that put Ukraine on the map of Europe, and the unexpected defeats of the Polish armies that especially aroused European attention. Thus, the year that so many Poles saw as foreboding and one of decline and crisis was seen by many Ukrainians as a year of birth and beginnings. Setting aside the much debated question of how much the revolt can in any way be seen as a national confrontation, one must recognize that the culture and polity of the Cossack hetmanate made Khmelnytsky and the revolt their foundation myth. As such, the Poles, and to a degree Poland, were the archetypal and classical other, and negative other, I might add. One can be aghast at the historical inaccuracies and unfair characterizations of Poles in the Commonwealth in the hetmanate's most influential texts. But one must accept that works such as Hryhory Hrabianka's Most Bitter War represented the elite's attitude of the early 18th century, while, as Serhiy Plokhy has recently shown us, the history of Rus spoke eloquently to early 19th century Ukraine. Indeed, no less a founder of Ukrainian historical thought than Hrushevsky describes his horrors reading about Polish tortures of Nalivayko in the history of the Rus. There were many other relations and narratives in the Ukrainian lands. One can recall Hadyach, Mazepa and Lishchinsky, and Orlik, but one still must see that the formative myth of modern Ukraine originated in territories where the revolt against the Commonwealth succeeded, and in the literature that glorified the revolt and the anti-Polish struggle. Now, just to give you a few short examples of this kind of literature of the early 18th century that goes down to the early 19th century. For example, in Hrabianka's text of the early 18th century, one finds in the style of Ars Historica the various speeches purportedly given by Khmelnytsky. And Khmelnytsky sends a delegation to the Cossacks to join his revolt. And what does Khmelnytsky say in this text, which is written no later than, say, the 1710s? Saying to them in the third person, "Whose blood are they going to shed? Not that of their brothers? Is not one mother Ukraine their birthright? For whom shall they stand up? For Catholic churches, or for the Lord's churches that gave them birth and spiritually raised them from the day of their christening? Do they want to help the Polish kingdom, which paid them for their courage with slavery, or their mother Ukraine, who wishes to endow them with freedom?" Pay attention to those concepts of slavery and freedom, and then place it in your contextual knowledge of Polish traditions of wolność and where wolność exists. Or then we find in the same text a panegyric. And it says to Khmelnytsky, thanks to him, Ukraine rose to its feet because in the Polish bondage it had almost perished. Or then when Khmelnytsky wants his son appointed as hetman, the Cossacks answer him. Why are they going to appoint his son? For your so famed services to the Zaporozhian host, they said, and for your martial deeds, for that you have liberated us from the Polish yoke through your wisdom and bravery, and for that you made us glorious before the whole world and made us a free nation. It is fitting for us to remember your kin even to your death. Now, I give these as examples not of either what occurred in the 17th century or as a long-term tradition, but certainly what the literature of the late 17th to the early 19th century purported was the Polish-Ukrainian relationship. Those are the texts on which modern national movements are formed in Eastern Europe. This is the literature that's read by the early awakeners of the Ukrainian Romantic period of the early 19th century. Now, what I also want to point out for those of you who study the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth is all of these texts arise not in the territories that are part of the Commonwealth until its partitions. They come from the areas that are lost by the Commonwealth. Now to turn down to the 19th and 20th century. The Polish-Ukrainian relation in the 19th century is quite properly depicted largely in social terms. One thinks of the Kłopomane, the testimonies of Włodzimierz Antonovich, Volodymyr Antonovich, whose populism caused him to change identity and question the rights of the Polish landowning nobility to the right bank. Serhii Belenki has recently provided us a compendium of the various imagined geographies and peoples of the Romantic period. Yet even though the social question was at the forefront, the explosive nature of the confrontation was also inbuilt in the basic geographic and political tenets of most of the adherents of the Polish and Ukrainian movements of the 19th century. The restorationist movements for the Commonwealth within the borders of 1772 stood at the core of Polish thought, only slowly modified in line with political realities. Within this imagined civic nation, Ruthenians, or even Ruthenian language and culture, might somehow be accommodated. In the case of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, even federalism might be considered. But Ukraine and the Ukrainian movement had a very different relation to the Commonwealth than Belarus and Lithuania did. All the Belarusian and Lithuanian territories were included in the old Commonwealth. For Ukraine, the 1772 border would have excluded the lands of the Cossack Hetmanate, and even almost as important, its offshoot of Sloboda Ukraine. Yet these were the very lands that had the elements of a multi-strata, that is a more complete Ukrainian social structure and cultural structure, and a specific Ukrainian high culture of the early modern period. This was also the culture that looked to the revolt of 1648 as its formative event. These traditions and lands served as the core for the formation of a modern Ukrainian cultural tradition in the 19th century. As some political thinkers, such as Mikhailo Drahomanov, saw the question, there was no way to fit the Ukraine conceptualized within these traditions and on the basis of an ethnic concept of Ukrainian nationhood within the shell of the old Commonwealth. Any restoration of the Commonwealth would exclude the core lands of the Ukrainian tradition, as well as the newly settled territories in the south and the east. The right bank long retained the traditions and social structure of the old Commonwealth. It is here that Timothy Snyder has made a case for an old Commonwealth noble nation being maintained almost to the end of the Tsarist regime. Yet it was also here that the backward social and civic structures kept the Ukrainian village intact, and whereas Daniel Beauvoir has shown, social antagonisms could quickly transform into national conflict. However much Vyacheslav Lipinski might dream of the nobles of the land leading a newly born Ukraine, that scenario was not to be. We may focus on the revolution and civil war that swept that world away, but the signs were not positive for this scenario even before the First World War. The Polish position on the right bank could not withstand social advancement of the Ukrainian peasantry and the changes that the Russian and Ukrainian national movements there portended. But in the end, it was Galicia that was to be the vortex for Polish-Ukrainian relations, in part because of Habsburg rule. It is significant that a Cossack scion from the old Hetmanate, and later a critic of the Kosakophile and Polonophobe tendencies in Ukrainian thought, Pantelimon Kulish, was to see this so clearly in his Krashanka, or Easter egg, presented to Poles and Ruthenians in 1882, a text which he, someone from the Russian Empire, could only publish in Ukrainian in the city of Lviv, where, of course, the Habsburgs had given the right for publication and use, even governmental use of Ruthenian. He compared the two peoples to two lions locked in mortal combat. In that all too narrow land between two seas, he described them as, quote, distressed by what has been and past, and desperate before what surely is to come. The two lions, the Ruthenians and the Poles, tear into each other's breasts to the very heart. Their eyes, shot through with blood and malice, can see nonetheless the joy their feuding brings to common enemies. He predicted, each prepares the other's destruction, but of this, not one of their descendants will be proud. Kulish quite properly directed his attention to Galicia, that small territory where Ukrainian-Polish relations were to take on a new intensity. One can find many contrary tendencies and attempts at rapprochement, and we will be hearing about many of them during this conference. But the dynamics of modern nation building and the very formation of civil society in the multinational Habsburg realm converted pre-modern ethnicities and confessional divides into two contending national communities, each convinced of the rightness of its claims. As pan-Polish views were followed by pan-Ukrainian views in the years before the First World War, the stage was set for confrontation. Facing a new type of Polish nationalism, the Ukrainian movement's challenge to the social and national hierarchy in the Crown land was to become increasingly strident. One thinks, of course, of Ivan Franko's condemnation of Mickiewicz as a poet of treason that so angered Polish circles. I leave it to the specialist Jaroslav Hrycak to deal with this complex issue. Let me instead turn to two figures that have occupied much of my time of late, Mikhailo Hrushevsky, 1866 to 1934, and Mikhailo Zabrydzki, 1856-1919, to illustrate how the Ukrainian national movement and its advances at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century inevitably deepen the chasm between Ukrainians and Poles in the Crown land, furthering their sense of separation. Hrushevsky, the migrant from the Russian Empire who took up a professorship at Lviv University, needs no introduction to this audience. His accomplishments and achievements, above all in turning the Shevchenko Scientific Society into a de facto Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, are well known. At the same time, this proponent of the Ukrainian populist tradition, who had been so moved by the Polish tortures of Nalivayko in the history of Rus, can hardly be called an admirer of Polish influences in Ukraine. In reviewing the English translation of Hrushevsky, Robert Frost has aptly described his history of Ukraine Rus as unmaking the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, and a concept I have borrowed in discussing Lipinski's work, and in many ways I think Lipinski dealt a much harsher blow to Polish traditions in Ukraine than Hrushevsky did. Łukasz Adamski has recently extensively documented Hrushevsky's Polish contacts in a monograph with the provocative title in Polish of Hrushevsky as a nacjonalista postępowy. But whatever one thinks of the appellation nationalist for Hrushevsky with its negative connotations in Polish, the core of his political message was to demand equality for Ukrainians in the Ukrainian language in Galicia, albeit with the subtext that Halychina, and Halychina means Eastern Galicia and the Lemko lands to the Ukrainian movement of this time, was a Ukrainian land. In the social and cultural constellation of Lviv University and Austrian Galicia, this was a radical postulate. For the Galician priest, Father Mikhailo Zabrydzki, the Ukrainophile message and the espousal of progressive social politics, the two together, Ukrainophile message, progressive social politics, put him on a collision course with most of the powers that be in what most Poles saw as their core land. Whether it was his insistence that he should be able to file papers in Sambir and Ruthenian before medical boards, or his demand that Latin Christian holidays should not be required to be kept in entirely Ruthenian villages, he argued for an equality for Ukrainian culture and social advantages for the peasantry. He even conceived a certain theology of nation, arguing that since the church should be on the side of the poor, it should side with the Ruthenians, and that Polish hope to efface the Ruthenians from the earth by assimilation went against God's plan. Just a short quote from Zubrzycki, which I think is of interest to show us the attitudes of the pre-World War I period in these regions. Zubrzycki writes, "According to Christ's teachings, God created all people, all nations, among them the Ruthenians and the Poles. Would the world exist without the Poles and the Ruthenians? Surely it would, but no one would be troubled by their absence. But while they live on this earth, it is obvious that they are needed, as much the Poles as the Ruthenians. And who insists that the Ruthenians should be effaced from this world, wiped from the face of the earth, distorts God's commandments, and this distortion is not from God, but from the devil." Now, we, of course, are dealing with the period of modern nationalism and the idea of the assimilation of the Ruthenians into the Polish community. We're already in the age of Dmowski prior to the First World War, and we see this reaction, and, of course, reaction with consequences, as we know. Well, November 1918 came as a shock for some of Polish society in Galicia, who still thought in terms of Ruthenians as a subordinate entity. Students of the conflict can see it as unavoidable. Here I shall take the lead of Iwan Lysiak-Rudnicki, from whose brilliant essay on Polish-Ukrainian relations many of the concepts in this talk are drawn, and who used the passage of Kulish as his incepted. This, by the way, I will mention this. This is the conference papers of the first major Polish-Ukrainian conference that was organized in the West in 1977 in English in Canada. And those of you who don't know this volume, I suggest you look back to see historical roots of many of the issues we will be discussing. I shall conclude with the Polish-Ukrainian War and the aborted attempts at a Polish-Ukrainian alliance in 1919-21. When Iwan Lysiak-Rudnicki wrote his essay, subtitled The Burdens of History in 1977, he concluded with his period, because we still had so little research on Polish-Ukrainian relations in the 20th century. I do so because by now so much has been done by specialists, many of whom will be speaking at this conference, but I also do so because I agree that 1917, 1918, 1919, the Poles and Ukrainians had crossed a Rubicon. The Poles had resurrected a state, albeit on only part of the territory of the old Commonwealth. The Ukrainians had established states, and despite these states' failures, had emerged with a quasi-state of the Ukrainian Socialist Republic, and with a broad constituency in Western Ukraine and the emigration dedicated to forming an independent Ukrainian state on all the territories claimed by the Ukrainian national movement. And what I maintain then, we have entered a new stage. A new stage of Polish-Ukrainian relations had been set in motion. Over whether and what kind of Polish and Ukrainian states would exist, on what territories they would be, and with what populations. The tragic and bloody short 20th century was the setting on which these contests and conflicts would take place, with totalitarian Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union determining much of the outcome. This all too sketchy summary has focused on the structural tensions in Polish-Ukrainian relations that date back to the 17th century and the conflicts that arose from modern nationalism and state-building projects. And yet, the short 20th century ended with independent Polish and Ukrainian states emerging who have clearly turned the page on what Lysiak-Rudnicki called the burden of history. I have been asked to depart from the historian's craft and to look into the future. I have argued that Cain and Abel, or to use Kulish's two lions, no longer prevail in Polish-Ukrainian relations. And I will allow myself some ruminations on what I witnessed over the last few decades and how this came about. Of course, the cynic will say that the excesses of the 20th century and the forced isolation of Poles and Ukrainians engineered by Stalin were crucial to the change. Still, I think we need to look at those who have provided leadership to nudge Poles and Ukrainians to depart from the path of fratricide. Once again, I should be biased toward the period I study and the places I have been. Considerable attention has deservedly been paid to the wise editorship of Jerzy Giedroyc and the achievements of Paris Kultura, above all in accepting the post-World War II borders, to the pastoral work of John Paul II, as well as to the policies of the Polish government after 1989. Let me turn to some of my own experiences on a few other minor, I admit, strands of reconciliation. In my path to the study of the early modern period, I was guided by Professor Zbigniew Wójcik, who was invited as visiting professor to the Mikhailo Hrushevsky Chair in History at Harvard in the early 1970s. When I began my thesis research in Poland, it was Professor Wójcik who ensured my access to libraries and contacts with many Polish scholars. Recently deceased, Wójcik played an immense role in the 1960s in changing the tenor of Polish-Ukrainian relations through the academic bestseller Dzikie Poля w ogniu. The 3 editions of the 1960s make it, in many ways, a bestseller we would all like to have. For a Polish public inculcated in the views of Sienkiewicz, those 3 editions were a window into seeing other ways to view Polish-Ukrainian relations. At a time when the early modern historiography was at its peak of development in Poland and the West, Wójcik's work served to break down the echo chamber that was Poland on Ukrainian issues in the 1960s. With Ukraine barely registering in Polish discussions, above all because of the hobbled and deformed scholarship that Soviet Ukrainian scholars produced under strict censorship, works such as Wójcik's took on a special significance. After all, they could even cite Hrushevsky. More names such as Jan Korczak, Władysław Szewczyk, many others could be added to this cohort, though contemporary history was still off bounds. Only now do the various Polish-Ukrainian commissions and the translation of works allow at least scholars and broader publics in Poland and Ukraine to hear and experience the other's perspectives, albeit still not sufficiently. When the Conference on Polish-Ukrainian Relations, at which Ivan Lysiak-Rudnicki's paper was held in 1977 in Canada, there was also a breakthrough that occurred in North American academia. Tackling 20th century and even contemporary issues, the conference stood out for its success in bringing academics from the 2 diasporas together. Such figures as Oskar Halecki, member of the Shevchenko Scientific Society, had already begun this process. That path, in many ways, was blazed by the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and Chair, and the close work on Omelian Prycak and Igor Shevchenko, who were in the end, in a certain sense, 2 emigres from Poland. Polish emigre scholars at Harvard, Victor Weintraub, Richard Pipes, and Adam Ulam worked closely with them. Above all, Wójcik's invitation to the Harvard chair opened a period in which dozens of Polish academics spoke at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. And I advise you to look at the minutes of that seminar, which were published in the 1970s, and it will give you a feeling of how deep and close relations were between the Ukrainian diaspora scholars and scholars in Poland. And I would argue that was the major access, not the Polish diaspora scholars, and we can discuss why later. I have turned to these few instances not to exaggerate their importance or to return for times for which I am nostalgic. I think they now belong to a prehistory of the events that have developed since 1989-91, and that history remains to be written. For example, we still lack a study of the activities of Bogdan Osadczuk, to mention only one of the prominent figures from the Ukrainian side. There are just a few strands that lead us to what will be a new phase of Polish-Ukrainian relations. I believe that sometime from the beginning of Paris Kultura and the abstruse seminars at Harvard, a new period of Polish-Ukrainian relations were slowly being formed. Much greater and cataclysmic events determined developments in the 2 countries, and above all, generation change was crucial. Yet sometime between then and the Maidan, Khmelnytsky's purported words were taking on a new life. Finally, free of the entanglements of centuries and entrenched ways of seeing the other, we will not be yours and you will not be ours, had finally worked its way out. But far from parting forever, this new situation can serve as the basis of a new relationship. What Rudnitsky called the burden of the past will not disappear. Conferences and discussions such as this will still evoke disputes and contending visions. But the basis of a new Poland and a new Ukraine, understanding that each as a separate state needs the other, seems quite firmly established. New concepts of civic identity in these two polities are being formed, including their European identities. The collapse of the Soviet Union gave each a chance for independent development, used well by Poland, that entered the European Union and NATO, and rather badly by Ukraine. Yet when the Euromaidan was formed, many Ukrainian citizens of all nationalities seemed to want to follow the path Poland had taken. The reaction of Moscow is putting Ukrainian statehood in danger and potentially threatening Polish sovereignty. Yet now the two states and societies have been liberated from the past so as to work together and build a new relationship. And so it is Cain and Abel no longer. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Sysyn. I'd love to open the floor for a few questions before we get started with panel one, when we'll have a little bit of movement here as we gather people onto the stage. I'd love to open it up for questions. Yes, Professor Petrovsky-Stepp.
Frank, thank you very much. I think I can correct my voice. Thank you very much for this presentation, and I like how you, it's for the recording, okay? If it is. I'm not sure if my words signify anything. Thank you very much for your presentation, Frank. I like how you lay out the genealogy of difference, how the two entities were getting out from one another and looking for their, separate paths. My question to you would be, where do we start not the divergence process, but the convergence process? When the two sides, recognizing the differences, start looking to at one another and saying, okay, we can learn from one another. In your genealogy, I was missing this moment of, let's say, chlopomania in Polish literature of the late 19th century, Revita Gawronski and his ilk, who are looking at Ukraine, especially at the period from which you started, mid-17th century, saying, well, we should reevaluate what these people are and what they mean to us. How would you date the beginning of this process when Poland and Ukraine actually look at one another and are trying to find new ways of understanding who they are vis-a-vis one another? Okay. Thank you.
From 1648, I date the process. That is, what I did, and I did consciously, was to pursue one train, one element of it. And I do so because I often find it missing in discussions of Polish-Ukrainian discussions, particularly the structure of the Commonwealth and this issue of territorial lands, which I find often missing in particularly the way in which Polish-Ukrainian relations are envisioned. So, for example, quite generally, quite naturally, historians in Poland study the history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So suddenly, those other territories fall out after 1648. They're not part of it. You can test how many Polish scholars have read Hrabianka and Velichko. Some do because they're interested in the documents, but it's not part of their tradition. And so they miss. What I was trying to put in was that central point missed, which is, and I think it comes through with the Ukrainian literature, of where, for whatever reason, the modern Ukrainian national movement idea and culture is formed, and then gets exported to the territories that were part of the Commonwealth. In so doing, of course, I left out my own major research. That is, I begin my research with Adam Kisil, whether he had a dilemma, man in the middle, wherever he was. He, of course, is the classic example of someone who was trying to find ways to square circles, put things together, as we know, unsuccessfully. And all through that period that's occurring, So there are attempts to do it. The question is, could they and each period is different. I mean, what this talk does, by going back 350 years, it oversimplifies, breaks down historical periods. I'm fully cognizant that nation and fatherland have different meanings in the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and 20th centuries. They change. But in each of these historical periods, there were certain structural problems with how this could be resolved. So if for Velichko, of course, the basic question for the Ukrainian Cossack elite of the early 18th century was, how can you put the two banks of the Dnieper back together? Well, to do so, you would have had to tear apart the two states that controlled these territories. Now, they didn't succeed. They leave behind an idea, not a structure. So in each of these periods, we have many, many cases. And I think we will be discussing many of them as we go on. Now, the other was the problem that is faced in 1918-21. To argue, when we look back, and I have not done a sufficient study to do so, there are some people in Poland who by the 1920s and 30s begin to understand that this structure is not viable that's created as a result of it. Would autonomy for Galicia, Eastern Galicia, have been enough? To be quite honest, I don't think so. I think after 1918-19, it's too late. There's no way. Once there was a Rubicon, they crossed a certain line. Once that line had crossed, it was not only the war, but the resolution of the war, and then the cults that are established. There were many people of goodwill who are trying, even within the context of the Polish state, and certainly viewing in general European traditions, who are trying to find a way around this. Very hard to conceive of how you could have reached that next step. Now, you cannot, as a historian, say that nothing else could have happened. Many things could have happened. Could there have been a way around it? Could the autonomy have been given to East Galicia? Would it have been able to have worked with a larger number of the society? Possibly. And of course, the outcome of World War II, which has so changed things. The most provocative thing that I guess I can think of is to say, what if the Germans had not lost the war and Poland had not gained the Western lands? The gdybys of history are of course very dangerous, but how could you resolve the Polish-Ukrainian relationship without the annexation of the Western territories? Where would Poland be? And where would the Poles be without that? So in a certain way, the German loss in World War II and the loss of Danzig and Stettin and Breslau and all of these places made possible the Ukrainian-Polish reconciliation.
We have time for maybe one more quick question before we start our first panel, if there is one. Obviously, the idea of this first presentation was to get you all thinking so that the questions and the exchanges we have later on can feed into that. So with that, I'd like you to please join me in thanking Professor Sysyn again for giving us the